why don't we welcome everybody? We made a rule recently that it's okay to say Happy New Year until January 10th, so we're still under the window. So Happy New Year and welcome to the first Ed Sessions 2.0 of January 2014. My name is Shay Anderson. I'm the Vice President of Ritter Public Relations, and I'm happy to be the host here for today, or at least until they kick me out. As you know, every month, Ed Sessions, or those of you who don't know, what we do here at Ed Sessions every month is feature a different education-related nonprofit that illustrates the Albertson Foundation's vision of limitless learning for all Idahoans. While you're unwrapping your food and getting ready and getting settled into your seats, I want to talk to you a little bit about a group we're highlighting here today. Today is One Stone, which is a student-led nonprofit organization that makes students better leaders and the world a better place. We lassoed a couple of students to come tell us about it. So today we've got Julia Grief and Brian Durkee. I'll tell you a bit about them. Julia is a senior at Timberline High School and is the chair of the One Stone Board of Directors. And Brian is a senior at Boise High and serves on the One Stone Governance and Planning Committee. They're here to tell us a little bit about One Stone, so please give them a warm welcome. Thank you very much.
All right, so I'm Julia, and One Stone is a student-led, student-run nonprofit organization, and we have over 130 high school students, grades 10 through 12, from all over the Treasure Valley. And our mission is to make students better leaders and the world a better place. And a unique aspect of One Stone is that our board of directors is made up of 2/3 students and 1/3 adults, so it really encompasses the ideal of a student-run organization. And then our other key aspect is that we utilize the design thinking process to formulate solutions for real-world issues. And so we use the process to create experiential service learning projects that target those issues. And so we are currently working on projects that target the needs of foster kids, special needs kids, children whose parents are incarcerated, and the elderly in the community. And we're also working on a project that is meant to increase the happiness and the kindness levels in the community. So that's kind of what One Stone is and what we're currently working on.
Hi, everybody. So I'm Brian, and I'm a senior at Boise High School. And I just want to share with you some of my personal experiences from One Stone. So probably one of the most amazing things that I've done was this past summer, I had the opportunity to write a book with St. Luke's staff and design a camp with Kristen Armstrong. I've learned how to speak publicly, which is something that I never thought I would do in a million years. I've learned how to act professionally in a workplace, as long as learn business etiquette, which is probably one of my most valued things from One Stone. And it's just the benefits from these opportunities that I gain in One Stone are unbelievable. And I know they don't just affect me. I've seen peers who I've known since first grade who are extremely shy. A month after they join One Stone, they're extremely outgoing. They're some of the funnest people I know. I've seen people without large self-confidence become some of the best project leaders, run some of the best projects that I've ever seen. And it's just amazing, these transformations that these people go through in One Stone. And I'm just so grateful that I've had the opportunity to be part of One Stone for the past year and a half.
So if any of you know any high schoolers around the Treasure Valley in grades 10 through 12, we would love for them to join One Stone. And if you would like to learn more information about One Stone, our website is onestone.org, and we're on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter, and you can search One Stone Idaho. So we would just like to thank you again for having us and giving us this opportunity to teach you about One Stone.
Can we do another round of applause? We have students here speaking to this group. That's really great. Kindness and happiness in the community. Brian, Julia, you guys have a lot of work ahead of you. I appreciate it. Thank you. So the Ed Sessions 2.0 is brought to you by the J.A. and Kathryn Albertson Foundation. The foundation is proud to sponsor the Don't Fail Idaho campaign, a statewide public awareness initiative to inspire an informed and productive conversation about education. You can find out more at don'tfailidaho.org. I also want to make sure I welcome our videocast participants every month. I wish it were weekly. We'd all get tired of each other. The edsessions.org, you can watch this presentation anytime, download the archive video. We will notify you as ticket holders. We will notify you when these are posted live. So please don't let them go unwatched. If there's people in your community or in your school community you think ought to see these, I know some folks use these for school trainings, and I want to applaud that. For our online folks, you can post questions on the Ed Sessions Facebook page at any time during this presentation. We will attempt to answer the ones we can make sense of. Unlike many events, we ask that you keep your smartphones handy. Maybe turn your ringer off, but we do want to see some tweets. We want to see Facebook posts. The hashtag we're using this month is #TheEdSessions. Hashtag. The theme of this year's Ed Sessions is what if? And we've asked all of our speakers who are going to come this year to help us answer the versions of that question in their presentations. So our speaker today has a great version of that question and some compelling answers, and I'm hoping you'll see that shortly. I also want to make sure I welcome the members of the Idaho legislature that are here today. Thank you for taking a time out from the second day of the session to come in and join us for lunch. I hope that we can give you guys some good ideas to work with going forward. Never let it be said that you don't get anything for coming to the Ed Sessions. For those of you who signed up for the full year's package of Ed Sessions tickets, we've entered your name into a drawing for a branded Kindle reader with books by Ed Sessions speakers you can load onto there. And I've asked our speaker, Michael Horn, to do the Vanna White number for me. Pick a name out of the card. It's bigger than I can keep in my pocket, so here's the thing. The winner is Rich Raimondi from Bishop Kelly, TVEP. Oh, he's not here? Oh, okay, he's not here. We're doing this again, people. Let's do this. Okay. The one guy. Bethany Haglund from Northwest Nazarene University. Are you here? So, if you can, Bethany, congratulations. If you can, find our staff, Corey, I believe you're here. There you are in the back. We'll find you and we'll get you your Kindle and we'll tell you how to load up the content onto it, and we'll all just start getting jealous immediately. For those of you who didn't get into this game, you can. We have another opportunity. We've placed a coupon in one lunchbox per table. Those of you who get a hold of these and haven't used it as a napkin already are eligible for a copy of Private Enterprise and Public Education, which is co-authored by our speaker, Michael Horn and Rick Hess. You can bring your coupon to the registration desk, which is back at the coat room area, for your copy of the book. And now that I've mentioned his name so many times, I'm going to tell you a little bit more about Michael Horn. My shorthand description for Michael this week has been to go around telling people, well, he's smarter than you. The longer version is he's the co-founder of the Clayton Christensen Institute and the executive director of its education program. He focuses on disruptive innovation in the K through 12 and higher education spheres, and I'll let him explain that concept in a moment. In 2008, Michael co-authored the award-winning book, Disrupting Class, How Disruptive Innovation Will Change the Way the World Learns. Newsweek cited that book 14th on its list of 50 books for our times. He's also written for numerous publications, including Forbes, the Washington Post, the Economist, the Huffington Post, and Education Week. And to the legislators here, take note, Michael does testify regularly at state legislative committees. Just saying. Michael was also selected as a 2014 Eisenhower Fellow to study innovation in education in Vietnam and Korea. I could go on, but it is natural that a guy like this make Boise, Idaho his next stop. So would you please join me in welcoming Michael Horn. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much. It's a pleasure to be here with you all today to talk about what if school looked like and to chart out what I think is an exciting vision for what our education system statewide here in Idaho, nationally in this country, is starting to move toward, as there are forces and opportunities I think that have actually never been here before, to truly put students at the center of their own education, to own it, to be able to personalize it so that every child ultimately can find their path to success and realize their fullest human potential. And my sense is that we're at a point right now in this state and elsewhere, a tipping point, if you will, where that is actually within grasp if we make steps over the next few years to set us up on that journey. And so what I wanted to do with my time with you all today, I come from this organization called the Clayton Christensen Institute for Disruptive Innovation, and it's become pointed out to me several times that disruptive innovation is not always the most friendly of sounding phrases. So I thought I would start by explaining what the heck is disruptive innovation. And I think it's an important concept because as we think about what if school looked like and what could this student-centered world look like in the future, how we move toward that is really important. And disruptive innovation, I think, will play a critical part in that transformation. I'll then sort of tell some stories about how disruptive innovation played itself out in sectors way outside of education, just so you can get a sense for how this theory and this force works. And then we'll talk about, just at the point where you're saying, okay, that's nice, what does it have to do with schools? I'll shift back to talk about how we see this playing itself out in K-12 education, what we think those opportunities might look like for students, teachers, and the education system going forward. And then I'll move into what I think are some of the short and longer term policy implications of some of this work and spend some time there, and then we'll open it up for some questions. So that's the basic roadmap for what we're going to do, and I guess I'll start right off with that question of what is disruptive innovation? And I think it's a really important question to start with because fundamentally what we've seen is that disruptive innovation, the word disruptive means a lot of things in the English language. When you're talking about disrupting class or something like that, teachers don't necessarily think it's all a positive thing. Many of my middle school teachers, when disrupting class came out, they thought it was my autobiography. But really, when we use the word disruptive innovation, when we use that phrase, we mean something very specific. And what we mean by it is it's the force that really transforms sectors where there are things that were complicated, expensive, inaccessible, and could only serve a limited few, into things that were far more affordable, convenient, accessible, customizable, things of that nature. And it's really that force that transforms sector after sector after sector. And so a way to think about it is if you look up here on the screen, you see that I've plotted a series of concentric circles. And what I want you to do is imagine that the innermost circle represents those people with the most expertise or wealth in a given sector. And that as you move out successive circles to those outer rims, it represents people who have comparatively less expertise or less wealth. And what we see in every world, every sector that we study, is that before the industry or sector gets started, people sort of exist out there in the outer fringes, and then there's a deeply centralizing new product or service or something like that that comes in the center circle and plants itself there to serve people there and leaves out sort of all the rest. And it's disruptive innovation is the process of decentralizing that world again to bring forth products and services that are more convenient and accessible to serve those people in those outer circles. So if we tell it through computing, before the advent of computers some 60, 70 years ago, if we had a computing problem, we all existed on this outer circle, we'd whip out our slide rule wherever we were and do some computations on the spot. And it was the advent of the computer, the mainframe computer specifically, that created the computing industry. But for those of you that remember, how many people remember mainframe computers? Show of hands. A few people. You guys are more honest than other states. So if you remember those early machines, those things would fill entire rooms. They cost $2 million to own. And you had to bring your computing task to the corporate mainframe computing center where experts would run computing tasks for you because it just wasn't accessible to ordinary folks like myself. Now, what happened was the first disruptive innovation was the form of the mini computer. Mini computers weren't particularly mini. They were about the size of this podium here. They cost $250,000, but they started to decentralize the computing world. And then the big disruptive innovation was the personal computer. Personal computer came out in the late 70s, early 80s. And for the first time, for a couple $1,000s, you could have access to a computer. Rather than bringing your problems to the computing center where experts would run it for you, the computer came to you at your desktop, where it was so simple that just anyone like me could fire it up and do some word processing or something like that on the computer. Now, there were a couple other features. If you remember those early personal computers, they were pretty primitive machines, right? People remember sort of struggling with them in the early 80s and stuff like that? Do you remember going up to those things and trying to do word processing on them? Yeah, to stop every once in a while and coax the stupid thing to catch up with your fingers. Because basically these early machines weren't even fast enough for a basic application like word processing. That's another feature of disruptive innovation, which is from the perspective of the inner circle, the people there look out and see this thing coming, and they say, that's not all that interesting. It barely can do word processing. But what they don't count on is that technology, reliably and predictably, improves faster than our lives change. So what at one point is not good enough for the majority of people, over time gets better and better and better, such that it actually gives us more performance than we can possibly imagine using. And so what happened was the personal computer got better and better, and by the late 80s it was good enough that people actually in that inner circle flocked to the outer circle because they were delighted with the product that could give them computing that was far more affordable, convenient, simple, accessible, and so forth. And that's literally how transformation occurs in sector after sector. Now, of course, that process has continued. We have laptops, netbooks. I suspect few of you use desktops today. And in the palm of your hand, you all have smartphones, I suspect, that literally pack in more computing power in the palm of your hands than existed on this entire face of the earth some 50 years ago during the mainframe era combined. You have more computing power in the palm of your hand than sent the first man to the moon. Which means that if you get bored at me at any time, you can just whip it out and become productive again, which is perhaps fortunate over lunch. But it's truly incredible how that process works. And we've seen it in lots of different sectors. So what I've done up here is plot in the Today column those companies whose stock we wish we had owned over the previous few decades. I didn't own any, that's why I'm here. And they were disruptive to those organizations in the Yesterday column who in their own right were once disruptive themselves. So you can tell a similar story through each one of these, right? So if we just do the automobiles line up there at the top, Toyota over the 70s, 80s, 90s was disruptive to the Detroit automakers, Ford and GM, right? Now, how did they disrupt the world? They didn't start at the high end with the high-flying Lexuses that I'm sure you all drove here today. They started at the low end with this crummy car called a Corona. Anyone own a Corona? Okay, yeah, we got that earlier. Yeah, there you are. So this car rusted pretty quickly. It wasn't all that great. But for those people who were in the outer circle, who couldn't afford the gas-guzzling cars that Detroit was sending down, they're what we call non-consumers, right? They literally could not consume those automobiles. They were delighted by this Corona because it was way better than their alternative, which was nothing at all. And then Toyota got predictably better. From that primitive Corona, they went up market to the Tercel, the Corolla, the Camry, the 4Runner, the Avalon, and then the Lexus, and quite literally changed the world. Now, to be fair to the folks in Detroit, within their inner circle, every once in a while, they'd look outside and say, you know, we really ought to go out there and compete with those buggers. And so they'd send down a Pinto or a Chevette. But when they compared the margins of selling one of those vehicles with the unmitigated blessing of being able to push out yet another Cadillac, Escalade, or Ford Explorer, it just didn't make any sense, right? So they'd retreat back to their inner circle, cede more ground, and by the time the 2000s rolled around, we know what happened with bankruptcy and other forms of reinvention. So you see this playing itself out, and incidentally, Toyota has been being disrupted today. Anyone know by whom? Hyundai, yeah, Kia, the Koreans, right? If we'd come here 10 years ago, we probably would have laughed at the quality of their cars. Now they're winning all the quality awards. They own the subcompact and compact ends of the market. They're not being too shy about it either. This is an advertisement Hyundai was running about a year or two ago where it says, isn't it time someone did to Lexus what Lexus did to Mercedes? Underneath them are the Chinese and Chery, and you can keep telling this story about how it plays itself out. So let's pivot now to thinking about education and how this force plays itself out maybe there. Our sense at studying this over the last several years is that broadly speaking, online learning has a lot of these properties of disruptive innovation that we've seen in sector after sector. Firstly, it started in areas of non-consumption where the alternative was nothing at all. you wouldn't have wanted to start with an online experience from the 1990s as your core academics for a variety of reasons. It really started in these areas of non-consumption where people had access to nothing. And so it was better than that, infinitely better than that. What's interesting in thinking about these prime examples of non-consumption is in the US context, where would these be? So just to make this a little bit sharper, if you were in a developing country, in an emerging market or something like that outside of the US, this would actually be fairly obvious because 70 million students worldwide have no access to primary schools. 200 million students worldwide have no access to high schools. Think about that for a moment. So you'd be starting from scratch. It would be pretty clear how you could start to create some pretty innovative forms of schooling. But from the US context, schooling is largely compulsory. Almost everyone has access to what they perceive as a free public education. And where would these areas of non-consumption be? And it turns out that if you look at the level of courses or subjects within schools, there's actually lots of areas of non-consumption where we see online learning planting itself to help give access where before there was none. And so you can tell a story through each of these about how this plays itself out. But credit recovery is an interesting one. In a lot of urban school districts, they have students who will fail a course in high school, have no meaningful way to make up that credit, and either they will progress to high school graduation and everyone acts shocked when they get there and they don't have the requisite credits to graduate, or they genuinely have not learned things that make them fall further and further behind in their academic careers that cause the second problem of dropouts that we know well across the nation. These are big areas of non-consumption where online learning can get snapped in different schooling models or class models to help bring students on. I want to focus on the third line item for a moment, AP and advanced courses, just because of the applicability in really small rural districts that dot Idaho in particular, but nationwide, 40% of high schools do not offer AP courses. And yet you know that there are students that want those opportunities. But the story is also bleaker than that. In 2007, 26% of high school students attended a high school that offered no advanced courses, period. Defined as anything above biology, so forget about chemistry and physics. Defined as anything above geometry, so no algebra 2, no calculus, and defined as any honors English class, period. Now you think about the educational challenge that we have in this country and educating students and giving them the opportunities that they need to thrive, and schools literally not being able to offer this full set of courses. It's a key reason why places like Idaho have leveraged and continue to leverage the Idaho Digital Learning Academy and other such entities to be able to offer the full set of courses. And what we're seeing is that the budget cuts and teacher shortages that we've been facing across the last several years, while they at first seem like a threat to the existing system, have actually been an opportunity in many ways for systems to ask, how do we do things differently? And can we be strategic about where we make cuts so we can open up areas of non-consumption that allow us then to fill them with innovative offerings? And so it's one of the interesting things is that it's been driving the growth of this disruptive innovation. And all of this led us in 2008 to make this crazy prediction that by 2019, based on the growth rates we were seeing, that 50% of all high school courses would be delivered online in some form or fashion. Now, what's interesting, when we came out with the prediction in 2008, everyone said we were dead crazy because public schools couldn't possibly innovate that quickly. And then the financial crisis hit and something interesting happened, which was people still thought we were crazy, and they're probably right, but they thought we were crazy because we were too conservative with the prediction. They said that it was happening faster than we realized. I sort of plead the fifth on this. I think we'll be right, plus or minus a few years on either side of it. But I think that it actually misses the bigger opportunity and discussion that we ought to be having. Because I think if we come back here in 2019 or 2020 or whatever else, and we've moved a lot of the system into a blended learning or online learning world, as the prediction would say is going to happen, but it still operates basically the way our current system does, then I think we will have missed the big opportunity, and none of us should feel all that good about it. So I want to talk about what I think are online learning's potential benefits, not guaranteed, but potential benefits to help move our education system to that student-centered one and away from our current one. The first one is fundamentally personalization. I'll talk about 4 benefits. The first one is personalization. Fundamentally right now, we have an education system that was literally modeled after factory design. We literally said factories are the way we are going to educate America's kids in the early 1900s, and so we'll batch them up in classrooms and we'll add value to them at the same rate and the same pace and the same day, and then ship them out the other side, and some of them will do great and some of them won't, and that's the idea of the system. And the challenge with that is it creates huge holes in people's learning, what educators refer to as the Swiss cheese effect. And the bigger challenge is if you're a teacher with 30 students and you're supposed to get through a particular lesson plan on a day, you have no idea which students where have which holes. And so it's unbelievably hard if educating every child is now the goal to actually do that in our current architecture. And the reason for this is that all students, and all of you here, ironically given that I'm lecturing, have different learning needs at different times. Some people learn material really quickly. Other people struggle to grab onto a concept until they truly understand it. And the reason for this, there's lots of arguments over learning style differences or things of that nature, but what no one disagrees on is that we all have literally different working memory capacities. Literally the amount of information that we can manipulate at any given time in the front of our brain, in our consciousness. And we all have different levels of long-term memory or background knowledge that we bring into an experience. And what that means, just quite literally here, is if I've used a phrase that's unfamiliar to someone in this room, even if it wasn't the purpose of what I was trying to get across, the human brain naturally will fixate on that phrase and sort of get embroiled on it and miss the actual point of what I'm trying to communicate. And as a result of this, we see lots of misconceptions, stereotypes, things get built up because of these differences that we just all have. And so if we want to educate every child to their fullest potential, one of the keys is to be able to personalize for these differences. And my sense is that online learning allows us that opportunity for the first time at scale because it can bring a lot of the benefits of a private tutor that most people can never afford for every single learning experience en masse. So this is a screenshot of the Khan Academy. People familiar with the Khan Academy? There's obviously a big project in Idaho going on with it. This is from a 5th grade classroom in Los Altos, California, where they implemented the Khan Academy in a blended learning arrangement. And you can literally see the different learning trajectories of each child. If we were to zoom in on the child highlighted in blue on those early days, what you would see is that the child started third to bottom in his math class in 5th grade. And so in a conventional system, we would have grouped that child into the low-performing math group. We wouldn't have called it that, of course, but that's what it would have been. It would have been the bumblebees or something. And then that child would not have seen algebra until 9th grade, would never have seen calculus, would have had very clear implications for remedial math and so forth. But what you can see is that there were just a couple concepts tripping up that child in their learning, and once it snapped into place, started soaring and moving much more rapidly. In the end of this screenshot on day 70, that child is actually 4th from the top of his math class. So the old system was literally education malpractice. And it wasn't the fault of any teacher or any principal or any superintendent, but it was because we had a faulty architecture in place. And so my sense is that online learning, by allowing us to pause, go at different paces, I can learn something relatively slowly for my needs. Jamie can move much faster than I can. I've learned in the last 24 hours. We can start to personalize for those differences. The second thing that this starts to open up is the opportunities for data and feedback. Now, at some level, this is fairly obvious, right? We get a lot more granular transparency around how students are doing. It informs their teachers so that they can make better decisions with them, and so forth. I actually want to make one particular point on this, which is that if we use data and feedback in our current education system, I fear that it will actually have the reverse of what we intended to do. And the reason is this. Currently, we have an education system governed by what we call seat time. Literally the number of minutes that you sit in a seat or how we fund and think about education. And so as a result of seat time, we have a system where you sit in seats for a fixed amount of time and every child's learning is variable. And what we know, so let me just actually illustrate it. We basically we deliver content to students, we test and assess. What happens at the end of the testing and assessment? Students move on to the next unit, grade, subject, whatever it might be, and they get their results afterward. Now, when you get data and feedback in a system like this, it is incredibly demotivating to learning. The research is extremely clear because you have no capacity to do anything with that feedback that you just got. On top of which, it's after the point of learning. And so it's almost irrelevant to what you need. And what we've seen very consistently is when you get data and feedback in this way that basically is telling you how you were a failure, you ignore it. It's demotivating. It doesn't make education fun. Conversely, if we can use data and feedback in a competency-based learning system, which I'm really pleased has become such a big topic within Idaho, that we can actually see something very different occur. So in a competency-based learning system, the learning is fixed and time is variable. So we still offer learning experiences for students. We still test and assess because testing and assessment is a critical part of learning. But the purpose is to get almost real-time and interactive feedback that informs what we do next. And students only move on once they've truly mastered a concept or a skill or deeper learning or something like that. And so it flips it on its head because in this way, data and feedback now become empowering to the learner so that they can do something and actually improve and work on things like persistence and grit and so forth that are so critical to life success. Now, the third thing I think that's really important in this is teacher effectiveness. Now, there's a nasty thing that went through this state and some other places a couple years ago where it was sort of a tech for teachers sort of narrative. My sense is that the digital learning or online learning or blended learning that we're seeing come in actually empowers teachers and does quite the opposite. And there's a fairly obvious reason why, which is it's hard to imagine in any other profession not giving the people who work in that profession the most up-to-date tools to be able to best serve the constituency that they're trying to serve. And yet that's what we often do with our educators. But I actually think it's a bigger sense of not only empowering teachers through that. We're actually seeing some really interesting models start to pop up across the country where we start to disaggregate the role of the teacher and say, hey, if you're really passionate about working in small groups with children and you don't want to be doing the data analysis to figure out the right intervention for these kids, that's okay, because we're going to set up some team teaching environments where you can actually work with your peers and have some collegiality on a more regular basis to start to do these things. And so models are popping up. This is an example from a school in Michigan, for example, that created a much bigger open learning environment floor. And the teachers, basically, they have content experts. These people often live virtually. They're able to answer really deep questions that students have. They have what they call the mentor or learning coach who's on the learning room floor with the students guiding you through, helping you stay up on top of it, really working one-on-one or small group instruction. They have what they call the project-based learning leader, someone who's really spending time helping set up deep projects to apply some of the knowledge that you're getting into things that matter for the community in this particular case. And then lastly, they have what they think of like a caseworker. But really, it's the guidance counselor in a useful function. So guidance counselors today have an impossible test because they have to do one guidance counselor to 300 to 500 students. And it's literally impossible to offer the guidance that students need in that ratio. But we know that a big part of the reason that students get tripped up in their learning is because it has nothing to do with academic problems. It's a whole host of non-academic things, like mom and dad had a fight last night, I didn't eat, health concerns, whatever it might be. And so they basically have a caseworker on the floor who's there with the students, constantly monitoring and be able to check in with students and so forth. So it's one model. I suspect there's going to be a lot of creativity that comes out of this. The last one is cost control. We're definitely seeing, and I won't talk a lot about this today, but we're definitely seeing people move to these environments to help contain costs and come up with models that actually boost educational productivity for their teachers. And in the state of California, where there's been massive budget cuts over the last several years, what's interesting is that the districts and charter schools have been rapidly moving to blended learning environments so that they can do more with even in the face of less. So, two more topics. This one is, will it fulfill its potential? And I think there's some positive news, and then I think there's some big questions. And the big questions, I think, have to come down to policy, and some of the positive news has to do with technology's inevitable advance forward. So let me talk about the positives first, and then we can talk about some of the question marks. On the positives, my sense is that just like every technology predictably improves, we're starting to see that with online learning as well. So if you went back some 10, 15 years ago to the online learning that was around then, the communication vehicles within the platforms were pretty clunky. Okay? This is a screenshot of a virtual classroom now that is starting to make communication much more ubiquitous between students to students, teachers to teachers, students to teachers. But I actually want to bring this home in a very concrete way. How many people used AOL in the mid-2000s for instant messenger? A few people, you guys, okay. So I worked there, so I apologize. But so did any of you ever try to click the video chat button when you were using it? You tried it? Did it work? No, it didn't work. Sorry. Did it crash your computer? We can talk about it afterwards. So, so if you think about how primitive video communication was back then, you'd hear the little dial-up sound and then it would crash and go out. And now, how many people use Skype or Google Hangout? Like a large percentage of you do. And you know you can communicate ubiquitously with almost anyone, anywhere in the world for basically free, right? And you just imagine how much better that's gotten from 2004 to 2014, and how much better in the next 10 years with touchscreens and 3D screens and improved connectivity that's going to be. It's actually pretty exciting to think about the communication we could do with students and teachers in these environments. The second thing is that the content is starting to get better and better. So if you went back to the late 80s when University of Phoenix first launched an online course, it was basically a correspondence course put online. And then through much of the 90s and even 2000s, a lot of the online learning looked a lot like my PowerPoint, sort of boring and flat with a lot of multiple choice questions. And it's okay, I'm not sensitive about it. But what we've seen is that there's starting to be content advances right now in these different vehicles to make the content fundamentally more engaging and tailored to different needs for students. So this is a screenshot from the Florida Virtual Schools 2008 or 9 based, it was a full video game based American history course called Conspiracy Code. In it, students ran 10 missions to save American history from becoming corrupted. Some of you may be joking, it's too late. But for many students, they did some really interesting research on this, really in-depth research. And for many students, they saw it was actually a deeply better experience for them to learn American history and more motivating. And the interesting thing was that they also saw it did not work for every student. And that's the point. So a lot of people, I think, celebrated this as, oh, gee, game-based learning won't work. That's not how I saw it. I saw it as we need tailored approaches to get students to turn on to learning. That's the research that we need. So we're seeing some advances in that. The third thing I think that we're seeing is that if we had come here 6, 7, 8 years ago and talked about online learning, most people here would have said that means distance learning. It just would have sort of floated in as a synonym in your head. My sense is that online learning, as it's improving, is really snapping itself into brick and mortar environments and what we call blended learning arrangements. And that's where the bulk of this is occurring. We predict that 90% of the growth of online learning will be in brick and mortar schools in these blended learning environments for the simple reason that most kids need a place to go during the day to be safe and have fun with friends. And quite frankly, parents kind of like them there as well. So, but in seriousness, with a lot of single-parent households and things of that nature, schooling is actually a very important custodial role in our society beyond the academic role that it plays. And so with the growth of blended learning over the last several years, we did a lot of research out of our institute on what is this field. So I just thought I'd share the definition with you so that you have a mental idea of what I'm talking about. When I say this, I'll give you the technical definition, then I'll boil it down. But it's basically a formal education program in which a student is learning, at least in part through online learning, where they have some element of control over the time, the place, the path, and or the pace of learning. So the things that start to make it student-centered, and that's a really important piece of it. The second part is it's got to be, at least in part, in a supervised brick and mortar location away from home. So we're generally talking about a school with a teacher, right? And then the third part, which is new in our definition, is that the modalities along each student's learning path within a given course or subject have to be connected in some way to provide an integrated learning experience. So what this means is that in the 1980s, if you got sent out by a teacher to do Oregon Trail, or to do just some Reader Rabbit, to just sort of do some babysitting on the side, that wasn't blended learning because it wasn't integrated with the rest of the small group or project-based learning experiences that you were having in that classroom. And so that notion of connecting experiences through data or other means is really important. So basically what we're talking about is online learning with some element of the student control there. In schools, experiences are connected. Importantly, this means that blended learning is not simply what we're doing here. Having an electronic whiteboard and beaming online curriculum at kids is definitively not blended learning. You haven't shifted that learning model so that students pedagogically start to have some element of control over the time, place, path, and or pace. And I want to make this a very big point because I think a lot of people hear me talk about disruptive innovation, and the easy thing to do is fixate on the technology. The model itself matters way more. How it's used matters far more than the technology. I can use any technology in a disruptive way or a way to sustain the status quo. It's the model that matters so much. And so similarly, just equipping schools with one-to-one laptops or providing digital textbooks, those things may be enablers of blended learning, but just because you have them doesn't mean you're doing it, okay? And so it's a really important point because in this country, we've spent over $100 billion equipping schools with computers, and we have basically nothing to show for it because we haven't thought about the learning model design itself as we went forward in those ways. And so to me, the learning outcome and goal should be first, design your model, and then pick the technology in service of that. I won't go into this too much. Basically, blended learning looks like there's a lot of different models popping up across the country. This is a confusing chart in which in the top line, basically brick and mortar schools meet online learning and they have a baby named blended learning. And then the baby blended learning has several different models of ways that it manifests itself in schools today. We can talk about that later if it makes sense, but I just wanted to give you a sense that blended learning looks different in different places, and some blended learning is good and some isn't, right? Just because it's blended doesn't make it a certain way. So let me conclude here with just a couple slides and what are the policy implications from this as we see the disruptive innovation growing. The first lesson that we sort of draw from our studies of disruptive innovation in lots of different sectors is that you have to move beyond the old metrics when a disruption is afoot. And the reason I say that, if you think about when the personal computer came on the scene, if we had judged it by the metrics of quality that we use to judge a good mainframe computer, the personal computer just would never have stacked up, or it would have come to look like the existing system, right? Because in the mainframe world, bigger was better. In the personal computer world, smaller was better. In the mainframe computer world, the more expensive, the more features, the more advanced and technical it was, the better. In the personal computer world, the simpler, more affordable we could make it, that defined quality. And so really being able to rethink what we want the disruption to do and how we judge it is really important. And so in education, my sense from having studied the history of it quite a lot is that we've really built a system that focuses on inputs today. It wasn't designed to be a learning system. So it mandates seat time. It's all about standardization, which, let me make a very clear point, is different from standards. Standards are really important for customization. Standardization is the opposite. It's when we mandate processes and how you have to teach and things like that, and is tremendously anathema to innovation. And so we've sort of controlled a lot of the levers that I've that I've put up here and been very prescriptive at the local level about how you could or could not educate students. And that's just a recipe for recreating the same thing that we have again and again. Whereas if we can really shift our focus as this disruption comes up to being very tight on student outcomes, but then empowering local educators to make the right decisions to realize those outcomes for their individual students, is a critical shift that we need to make in our policy. So I think of student outcomes as a sort of a balanced way of looking at it. I don't think we should look at one measure per se, but I think, and so I've put up 5 here in particular: individual student growth, college and career ready standards, proficiency, closing the achievement gap, and graduation rates. This is from INACOL, INACOL, their work on thinking about performance and what student outcomes should look like. To me, the most important one here is individual student growth. Being able to look at every single individual student, having the transparency to understand how they are growing through a system, and so that if a student comes in to 5th grade but is reading at a 2nd grade level, and that teacher is able to get that child up to a 4th grade reading level, we can applaud that, because that is a huge advance. And the problem with our accountability system today, by just looking at the snapshot in time, misses all those stories of growth, and it's no wonder a lot of people sort of feel hamstrung by it, because not only do they not have control over a lot of the processes and inputs, they also, the outcome measure is a little clunky for what we're actually trying to get at. A couple other things to realize that. My sense is that as these disruptive innovations grow, moving into models that are funding the outcomes for them and make it for a self-sustaining path are really critical, so that as the disruption grows, funding can grow alongside it to support and foster that is really, really important. So I've put dollars following students, but what I really mean by that is figuring out self-sustaining funding models that can drive that disruption. The Florida Virtual School in Florida has done a very interesting thing where they get funded only when students actually successfully complete courses. It's an all or nothing formula there, which I think is not quite right. But I think starting to move on these disruptions, holding them to higher standards than we do the current system, is actually the right place to be on these new innovations. The second one, I think, is that we've learned a lot from the charter sector, which is that a portfolio approach is really important as we're innovating. Having a marketplace of choices and options so that we can provide these customized opportunities for students on the ground. And secondly, having multiple authorizers so that we can provide quality avenues to get different approaches that might not otherwise see the light of day into the education system. And then the last one I would just say is I think the infrastructure undergirding this is really important, and that's why I'm heartened that Idaho, with the Albertson Foundation, has taken some big steps forward in broadband connectivity for schools. But having adequate broadband and wireless is absolutely critical in understanding, not just at the school level, but into the level for individual teachers in classrooms and so forth, what that connectivity actually is to undergird this, I think is really important right now. And I'll put 2 other things there on the list as well, which are there. One is, I think we need to move to an assessment system that is not once a year all or nothing, but an assessment system that is much more chunked up, and that as students are ready to show mastery, they can take assessments that are on demand to prove that they actually understand something, which would give us both a fairer system for the educators, but also a more accountable system, because as Joel Klein, the former chancellor of New York City Schools, always said, he'd like to call up his deputy on December 1st and say, "How are we doing this year?" They said, "Joel, check back in another 10 months. You could actually start to have data systems that give you transparent student level data that tell you how any classroom school is doing any day of the year, so you could provide more or less support as is needed if we started moving to this infrastructure. And my sense is that that we're not thinking deeply enough by this right now. As we move into an exciting opportunity, I think, with the Idaho core standards, which I think are an important, critical pillar to moving toward this customized and personalized future, but really thinking about how do we assess them in chunk-sized, on-demand ways, I think is going to be both a big opportunity, but a big pitfall if we don't take advantage of it over the next couple of years right now. So those were a lot of thoughts. I appreciate your time, and I'm looking forward to some questions. Thank you.
Did you guys get all that? We are going to take a short break, and this is an opportunity for you to speak amongst yourselves at the tables or even mix up the tables. But the idea here is to get some questions generated. And what we've got are cards on the tables. There should be pens there. You can steal mine. And we'll have staff coming around. If you can, we will pick up your questions, bring them to me. I'll try and shuffle through them and get as many of them asked as I can. We'll also draw some from the online folks who are out there, and I appreciate you watching. So take a few minutes. We'll come back to the stage with Michael. Thank you. We'll get this rolling on the question and answer period. I have a stack of questions. Feel free to keep scribbling. The staff are moving around through the table so they can bring them up to me. But as you can see, Michael generates questions. I like that. Also, as a side note, one of the things people asked for after last year's sessions was that we free up some time after the event is over. We try and get you guys out of here by 1 o'clock, and we're going to stick to that. But we have the room and this guy for about 30 minutes after that. So if those of you who just didn't get that question answered, stick around. You can buttonhole him a little bit, and we'll try and do this civilized. So the first question comes to, this is one that gets asked often, but I like it. I'm going to ask it right off the top. What is the single most important thing Idaho can do to move toward this educational model?
Wow.
Yeah, small question.
Yeah, not a small question, but you have to do one. So I think that competency-based learning right now and getting away from a seat time system is to me the number one thing that we need to move away from in Idaho and nationally. Just because I think that the seat time system undergirds so many of the false choices and perverse incentives that are created in the current system. So to me, competency-based learning would be the number one.
Okay. How do you, well, let's see, and this is a follow-up, not from the same person, but how do you create or implement that competency-based learning system, and has anybody achieved it? Anybody out there working this?
So no one's achieved it yet, and there's a lot of white space to sort of figure this out. My sense is, with one exception actually, if you look at Finland, which gets all this attention for a variety of things, they actually have versions of competency-based learning actually already embedded in their education system, and no one ever talks about that. So I actually think there's some lessons to learn there, not to port over exactly, but to just try to study. And I don't know a lot about it, how it works there, but that's one thing. There's a lot of states doing a lot of experimentation right now. New Hampshire in 2005 abolished the Carnegie unit, which is the fundamental unit for seat time, and has been moving more and more aggressively to try to move their schools to competency-based models, making them all adopt competencies as their sort of undergirding of their schools by 2008-9 and so forth. I will tell you there's a couple problems with it. One is schools, organizations are really good at doing what they were created to do and not good at doing what they were not created to do. It's sort of a truism, but it's a truism because it's true. And so my sense is that migration is actually a very rocky path right now, and that the level of implementation within states like New Hampshire, Maine, Iowa, Oregon that have actually done some pretty big moves toward abolishing seat time and moving to competency-based, the state of implementation is all over the place right now. So personally, I think that one of the things that will be very important to helping move that is to get the assessment systems and the student level data systems in place so that there can be a lot more trust across the system to help navigate us in that way. And so to me, those are two of the areas that I think there's really importance right now, getting the assessments, because at the end of the day, assessments define what standards are and aren't, right? And getting that transparent level student data system.
Okay, I think you're starting to answer this question a little bit, but let me ask it anyway. How do we free up schools to make these changes, and what do schools need?
Yeah, so so a couple things. One, I think that schools need space and flexibility to try these learning models in new areas. And I would really target the areas of non-consumption that I have mentioned as places to experiment. I wouldn't necessarily go whole hog and do a radically disruptive model tomorrow in your comprehensive high school, just because there's a lot that'll go wrong in that, and I think that puts the risk of failure politically a little bit too front and center. I would be strategic about how you approach this if I were schools. From a policy perspective, free them up so that they have more control over the inputs, giving a lot of the budget decisions down to the principal level even, and then allowing schools basically within their core academic classes. So I didn't go into this range of talking, but my sense is actually several of the blended learning models are not actually disruptive. They're more sustaining innovations to our current classroom. And those are the sorts of models, station rotations, where students are rotating through a small group experience with teachers, say online learning on their own, maybe a group project within a given subject. Those sorts of implementation, or flipped classrooms, things like that, I would implement tomorrow if I were a school in my core academic classes. And then in my areas of non-consumption, I would try the bigger reaches toward the disruptive blended learning models, which we call a flex model, where you sort of can move flexibly and fluidly through different learning activities as makes sense for you as an individual student. You sort of have an individualized playlist, or the a la carte model of blended learning, which is actually what you have had in the state with Idaho Digital Learning Academy for many years now, where you're able to take 1 or 2 online courses in certain areas of need. My sense is that doing the more disruptive things there in the areas of non-consumption is where I would start to move toward this direction, so that you can start to get experience. And on all the disruptive models, put in places the competency-based things and all those structures at the outset, so that it becomes ingrained with these new models.
All right, let me shift gears a little bit here. Several of the questions people are asking have to do with how we help teachers get ready for this kind of model. And that this would require, one questioner asked, this would require a shift in teacher education. And how do we appropriately enact change to guide these educators who are now working in the system toward a blended education system?
This is a really good question. It's a really tough one, too. My sense is that the education community made a mistake over the previous couple decades, sort of saying professional development in and of itself was a silver bullet for helping integrate technology in new ways, and that didn't really pay off. But my sense equally so is that as we move in these blended learning models, that the role of the teacher quite obviously shifts pretty profoundly from being the sage on the stage to the hackneyed phrase guide on the side. And that's a really profound shift. You talk to the educators in these really good blended learning models around the country, and you say, okay, so you're doing something really different. Were you prepared for this? And they're like, no, 5% of my training prepared me for 95% of my current job. 95% of my training prepared me for 5% of my current job. And that's literally unfair. So I think we need to think about professional development very seriously, but it has to be in service of the learning model and the individual supports that the teachers need themselves. And you may or may not have caught this, but on my slide of non-consumption areas, I listed professional development. Because although most teachers have access to professional development, it tends to happen 4 times a year when a boring speaker who's written a book like myself comes to talk to you, and you teachers sit in the back and like grade homework while I drone on, and then they get credit. But my sense of it talking to teachers is that you have professional development needs that happen every single day with particular students in your class, just-in-time help that you need at any given time. And so if we can think of actually online learning as a delivery mechanism to provide that just-in-time support, or to move to these team teaching models where you have your colleagues to bounce ideas off and so forth, I think actually there's some pretty exciting ways to deliver that professional development that could be empowering to teachers to get them what they need. Because it's pretty clear some teachers are very comfortable in these environments. Some teachers are still lesson planning for 30 students as though all 30 students are in the same place, so they need a little more support. So it's a huge question. I just think it has to be in service of the learning model that you put in place in your school as you attack it.
All right, I'm going to get down to some of the student outcomes and measuring some of those. Several of the questions are along these lines of that Khan Academy graph that showed the one student. It showed the benefit for one student, but how do you close the achievement gap, so to speak, for the other students, the black lines, who fell behind?
Yeah, so I think a few things were going on in that chart. One, I think that Khan Academy in 2010, when that screenshot came out, was a super primitive system that couldn't possibly do all that maybe people were asking it to do. The second thing that in that chart is Los Altos Public Schools. Someone's from Los Altos here originally. There you are. you can tell them, I mean, it's a high-performing school district already. It was like 96% proficient before Khan Academy, and like after it was like 96.8. So you weren't, now the interesting question was we weren't measuring growth, so we don't actually know how much of a boost it gave individual children, because kids in that 5th grade class were actually doing trigonometry by the end of the year, which I left out of the story. But I think some interesting things can happen if we start moving to a truly personalized student-centered system and start improving. I think students will go faster than we give them credit for. The evidence out of the couple competency-based learning school districts in like Chugach, Alaska, and some places like that have made full shifts is actually all students move faster than you think that they're capable of. Because it tends to be that the skill deficiencies are really targeted in some particular areas, and as you solve those, it sort of unlocks them to faster learning. And keeping them on what we call teacher minimum pace is really important. It's not that you can say, well, you can take 5 years to do adding double digits or something like that. It's no, you stay up, and so the teacher puts more and more time on those students who are struggling the most. And so that's part of the answer. I think in Tom Vander Ark, who's coming next, we'll talk about this too, I suspect. I think it's an interesting question about the achievement gap, what this system will do to it. My sense is that it will actually increase some gaps, but I think it will eliminate gaps along the lines of poverty or race. And so while certain students, I think, will legitimately fly much faster, I think my sense is that it should get decoupled from your background entering the education experience. And so there will be gaps. There's no question about it. And it shouldn't be measured based on how much of a subject you know, but maybe how far you've gone. But I don't think that they will fall along the familiar lines. At least that's what the early evidence from looking at this in a couple of those districts seems to suggest, is that you can start to break those sorts of relationships that happen right now.
Okay, well, we're going to get close on time, so I'm going to hand you a humdinger to answer for us. I know it's on the mind of Secretary Luna, who's over here as well. These are all along the same lines of funding for a model like this. How would you fund a system like this? What's the cost to transition to a blended learning model? How does a student-based funding system work in a way that avoids inefficiencies? Small topic.
Well, those are easy questions, so I'm glad. It's where the rubber hits the road. I think the reality is we're experimenting right now. I was really intrigued when Louisiana a couple years ago moved to a course choice funding model. I thought we would learn a lot from it. Unfortunately, it was unconstitutional by the Supreme Court there, and so they struck down that funding model. I think in the next week and 2 days, week and 1 day, we will see a evolution in Louisiana that has moved their funding model a little bit forward, and we'll see what we learn from that. I think we need some experimentation out there right now to figure out what's the right way to transition districts to this world. It's very clear that there is an upfront cost, but there are savings on the back end, it seems like. And supporting that is one thing I think we need to think about. The second thing, I think, is how do you allow these disruptions to grow and yet not immediately threaten the existing system such that they clamp down on them? I think that's something we're struggling with as well. Florida seemed to have done it pretty well with a line item appropriation and then moving to per pupil funding, but they still had a hold harmless provision in there for many years for districts so that they weren't getting penalized completely as students were taking courses through alternative mechanisms. So I think we're just sort of grappling with this still, and it's actually an open area. New Hampshire, last one just to end on a New Hampshire example. They have the Virtual Learning Academy charter school there, which literally as students make progress through the course, they get funded as they master material. So if a student has mastered 10% of the material, then they get 10% of the funding. When they've gotten through 20%, then they get 20%, 30%. And so in essence, progress or mastery has replaced average daily attendance in New Hampshire Virtual Learning Academy charter schools, the way that they fund that particular program. I have no idea how that would scale across a state. You would need a really good data system and finance system to make that work. So it's like a really interesting question. And I just don't want to kid anyone and say we have an answer to it right now. I don't think we do, but it's why we need some innovation and some experimentation and some pilots to sort of tick and tack our way toward that future.
Thank you. Let's give a hand to Michael Horn here. To those of you who had the coupon for the book, don't forget to pick that up at the registration desk at the outside as you leave. I want to thank everyone for coming. I told you we'd get this done by 1 o'clock. We've got legislators who got to get back to work, including Lieutenant Governor Brad Little. Thank you for being here, everybody. Join us next month. As Michael said, Tom Vander Ark will be joining us here for Ed Sessions in February. Stick around if you have the time. Michael will be here for another 30 minutes or so before we jump him on a plane. Thank you very much, and we are adjourned.